The most notorious wedding of the 20th century takes place. There are no flowers, no rings. The bridegroom, Adolf Hitler, declares his loyalty to his new wife.
I have now decided to marry the young woman who came of her own free will to this city in order to share my fate.
The bride is Eva Braun, the Führer's mistress for 16 years. Above their heads, the Russian army is moving in for the final kill. The marriage will last 36 hours. The next day, Mr. and Mrs. Hitler kill themselves.
She goes to death with me as my wife, according to her own desire.
Their bodies are dragged out of the bunker and burned. Within a week, the war in Europe is over. To the outside world, the woman who became Hitler's wife was totally unknown. Their relationship was one of the best-kept secrets of the Third Reich. What really lay behind the story of Adolf and Eva? Did they love each other? Was Hitler capable of love? What was their sex life? Indeed, did they have sex at all? In this film, Eva Braun's maid gives for the first time the definitive answer on Hitler and Eva's lovemaking. And Eva's cousin suggests that in a curious way, Eva achieved nobility.
I think it is a mystery. And for me, it began like a very, very simple love story, and it ended in a Greek tragedy.
Adolf Hitler may now seem unattractive, even repulsive, but at the height of his power, he was the most desirable man in Germany.
In his own way, at the time, he must have been very attractive. Power is very attractive. You know, it is a sexual, huge sexual come on.
Hitler hat eine ganze Anzahl von Verehrerinnen, ja.
Hitler had a whole number of admirers. First of all, there were the ordinary people. Then there were the more intensive admirers. And finally, the hysterical ones, who would shout out loudly, "Herr Führer, I would like to have a child with you."
At the Berghof, his Bavarian mountain retreat, Hitler had the world and any number of brilliant women at his feet. And yet, after his rise to power, the only woman who shared his bed was an ordinary girl from Munich. The Schellingstrasse, Munich, 1929. An unassuming middle-aged man calls at a photographer's shop. Inside, a 17-year-old trainee, Eva Braun, returns some albums onto the shelves. She cuts a striking, youthful figure. The man is instantly attracted. Later, Eva tells her sister,
"I remember him devouring me with his eyes. After he had gone, my boss pulled me aside and asked me, 'Haven't you guessed who that gentleman is? Don't you ever look at our photos?'"
That gentleman was an up-and-coming politician, Adolf Hitler, 23 years Eva's senior. She was impressed.
She also was proud that a man so much older than her showed interest in her. And I don't know whether at that time she knew who he was or what he intended to be.
Eva was a good Catholic girl from a respectable lower middle class background. Her father was a schoolmaster. She was educated at a convent in Simbach, southern Germany. Across the river lay Braunau in Austria, where Hitler had spent part of his childhood. From a young age, Eva had hankered after a more glamorous world.
She was someone who loved movies and operettas, musicals, and adored gossip and talking about, above all, about actors and actresses. And, you know, she had this in common with Hitler. Hitler loved that sort of thing.
In the early days, the relationship was a furtive affair. Eva would wait for Hitler in Munich's Schelling Salon. To take such an older man home was out of the question. But Eva's parents began to realize something was going on. Eva and her sisters, Ilse and Gretel, were expected by their father Fritz to stay at home until they married. At this time, before Hitler became Chancellor, Herr Braun had only contempt for the Nazis and described Hitler as that Austrian tramp. He wrote to Hitler, asking him to break off the relationship.
I know that I am thereby defending a point of view that, alas, seems old-fashioned. This is my code of honor. I conclude this letter with the plea that you will not encourage this thirst for liberty in my daughter Eva.
Fritz Braun's letter went unanswered. It was probably destroyed by Eva before it reached Hitler.
Yours very respectfully, Fritz Braun.
In these early days, the nature of the relationship remains unclear. Some saw it as a father-daughter friendship. It might not even have been a fully fledged affair. What is clear is that as Hitler began his rise to power, Eva became unhappy. She had wanted to spend time with her famous man, but the more his fame grew, the less time he had to spare for her.
She was a very, very happy girl. And I think meeting Hitler, everything changed for her. So she became depressive, simply depressive. Hitler was in Berlin, she was in Munich, and she was waiting for his calls, and the parents shouldn't know to whom she is calling, because at that time she lived at home. I think it's not a beautiful life for a young girl.
Eva began to feel more and more desperate. On the 1st of November 1932, she took her father's pistol, turned it on herself, and fired. The bullet just missed the artery in her neck. Hitler, then in the middle of his campaign to become Chancellor, rushed to her bedside. Her cry for help had been answered. To Hitler's immense relief, Eva survived. The last thing he could afford was scandal. What neither Eva nor the German public knew was that just a year before, another mistress had also tried to kill herself and succeeded. Her death and Eva's survival would provide the clues to a tantalizing mystery. Was Adolf Hitler capable of love? In January 1933, 2 months after Eva Braun's suicide attempt, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. He began to spend 6 months of every year at the Berghof, his country seat of government in the Bavarian mountains. Today there is little left of Hitler's mountain retreat. No statues, no memorials, just a few bricks and stones. Yet in the 1930s, the high summer of the Nazi years, He came here to enjoy the fruits of his political success. Eva would also spend more and more time at the Berghof. But Germany's new Führer was keeping something from her and from his people. Hitler had had another secret relationship, also with a much younger woman, his niece, Geli Raubel. Geli had lived with her mother, Hitler's half-sister, in a suite of rooms in Hitler's bachelor flat in Munich. Their incestuous affair was intense and possessive. On the 19th of September 1931, 2 years after Hitler first met Eva, it appears that Geli came across a letter from Eva in Hitler's coat pocket. A few hours later, she was found dead. She almost certainly killed herself. Hitler was inconsolable after Geli's death. He created a special room in the Berghof to commemorate her.
Und vor dem Spiegelschrank stand
In that room there was a wonderful oil painting, and one day my wife said, "Look, Hitler is here. We must go to Geli's room and air it out and dust it." Then she said to me, "Do you know who that lady in the painting is? That is Geli." And I had no idea. That room was like a shrine to him, and Eva Braun never knew anything about that painting.
Eva Braun nie was gewusst und dieses Bild hat verehrt.
Did this reaction mean that Hitler truly loved Geli? He certainly had his passions, music, architecture, art, and his dogs. But people?
I don't think he had an enormous capacity for love at all. I think he had an enormous need for emotion. That's different.
What is sure is that after Geli's death, Hitler's memory of her became obsessive, probably intensified by guilt at her suicide. So what were his feelings for Eva, who had also tried to kill herself? Was it love, affection, guilt, or a certain protectiveness?
Eva was more than a convenience. It's easily said, you know. All right, so he was in love with Geli. She committed suicide. After that came Eva, and she was there to go to bed with. But I don't think so. I don't think so. I think there was more to it, and certainly she was very attached to him.
There were certainly signs that he was fond of her. For example, the pet name Hitler gave Eva in private. Her housemaid, Gretel Mittelstrasse, found out about it after determined detective work by her husband.
Das habe ich zwar nie gehört selber, das haben sie von der Öffentlichkeit nicht gemacht.
I never actually heard it myself. They never used it in public. But there was a safe in the room between the 2 bedrooms to which I had a key. And in this were all the letters between him and her. I had access to it. I was never indiscreet, not something we ever did. But my husband was determined to find out what he called her. And so, on one day, I pulled out a letter just far enough so that you could read the opening line, and it said, "My dear little one."
Und das hieß dann mein liebes Chapel.
Such language suggests the relationship of a sugar daddy with a pretty young thing. So what about sex? According to his enemies in the 1930s, Hitler was a sexual pervert. Otto Strasser, an early associate who turned against Hitler after his brother was murdered by the Nazis, claimed that Hitler was incapable of normal love and had unusual sexual appetites. This, he alleged, was why Geli killed herself. By contrast, Christa Schröder, Hitler's long-term secretary who kept a diary of her time with him, believed that after he rose to power, sex went out of the window.
From the moment Hitler decided to become a politician, he renounced such pleasures. My lover is Germany, Hitler emphasized again and again.
Eva never fully revealed the intimate details of her relationship with Hitler, but now her maid has spoken out for the first time in 60 years to lay the matter of their sex life to rest.
Ja, das war normal, Mann und Frau.
Well, it was a normal one between a man and a woman.
Normal.
Perfectly normal.
Das weiß ich. Aus dem einen Grunde.
I know that because when she had her period and he arrived unexpectedly, then she would get something from Dr. Brandt, who was our in-house doctor, to suppress the period. I know that because I collected it from his room.
There is some further evidence from Eva herself. Hitler's drawing room was, she claimed, where they first made love. When the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain visited Munich in 1938, he sat on the red sofa in Hitler's drawing room. If only Chamberlain knew the history of that sofa, confided Eva to a friend. But any thoughts of a family were out of the question.
Once we asked Hitler, "Why did you never get married?" He replied,
I wouldn't make a good family man. I don't want any children of my own. The descendants of a genius have a hard time in the world. They are faced with the same expectations as the famous forefather and are not forgiven for being mediocre. Apart from that, they usually turn out to be idiots.
It appears that for Hitler, Eva simply provided the comfort of sex and a bit of levity.
She was gentle, gay in the old sense of the word, and gentle. She was not a flirt, you know, that was not it. She was very much of a lightweight, but a lightweight with real feeling and a capacity for joie de vivre. Of course, I'm not sympathetic to Hitler at all. I don't care a damn whether he had lightness or whatever. I'm just telling you what I believe existed and why this this simple girl, simple young woman was so important.
As her suicide attempt had shown, Eva wanted more. As Hitler became ever more preoccupied with creating the Nazi state, he had become more impatient, less courteous. Eva was forced to accept second best or nothing.
Konnte ich vollkommen verstehen.
I suffered with her, had empathy for her suffering, but she never wanted it any other way. At the time, let's say up until the war, Hitler was one of the greatest statesmen, and so Eva Braun thought to herself, I will never find another man like that. And then she was always so intense, trying to build on the friendship. But he always let everything slide. He was somehow put off by it.
Hitler certainly treated Eva very cavalierly. I mean, he was not a gentleman, you know. He treated her like a belonging. He diminished her in her presence. You know, he once said that a man like he must never marry or be with an intelligent woman. Only very simple or stupid women were right for their purpose.
Hitler's callousness created a risk. In the early months of 1935, Eva kept a diary which became dominated by feelings of loneliness, of how she was always waiting for Hitler, and how far away he seemed in Berlin.
He is not coming again for another 2 weeks. Until then, I'll be miserable and restless. I'm racking my brains to find out why he left without saying goodbye to me. Why do I have to go through this? If only I had never set eyes on him. The weather is so wonderful, and I am the mistress of the greatest man in Germany and in the world. How can he have so little understanding as to let me remain here, vowing to strangers? I shall go out and buy some more sleeping powder and go into a half-dreamlike state.
On May 28th, the last diary entry reads,
If I don't receive a reply before 10 tonight, I'll simply take my 25 tablets and fall asleep very gently.
That night, Eva took the tablets. It was her second suicide attempt, but like the first, she had not quite done enough to kill herself. It seems that it was another deliberate cry for help. Hitler, once again terrified of potential scandal, rushed to the hospital in Munich, bearing the present Eva had always wanted, a puppy. He then arranged for a monthly allowance and bought her a house away from the prying eyes of the German public. Her status, he assured Eva, was secure. She, and only she, would be the Führer's mistress. For Eva, although Hitler was there less than she wanted, these were the best of times at the Berghof. She was living an illusion. As the clouds of war gathered, her relationship with Hitler would darken with them. By 1938, with Hitler a grand figure in public and a plotter of war in private, Eva Braun was becoming something of an irritant to her moody lover.
Aber kam pfeifend runter.
If you heard him whistling and making great detours, then you really had to avoid him. There was no talking to him, nothing to be had out of him. And that was something which Eva Braun often minded and often criticized him for. You've got that look again, that bad look, and your shoulders are hunched. And he would say, you don't know what weight I'm carrying on my shoulders.
She was really hidden. She was never allowed to attend meetings. I mean, she was always sent out of the room when anybody official came. Really sent out of the room, you know. She was not part of his official life, ever. That must have been painful, too, for her.
In the summer, she would go swimming. And the way it always happened with Hitler is that all the talks and all the conferences would take a great deal longer. And so the ladies and their sisters and friends would arrive. They would always find themselves coming back too early and did not dare, and of course were not allowed to show themselves at the house. They would come to the tradesman's entrance next to my office, and they could get in that way. And I would go ahead and check if the coast was clear and take one lady after the other, so that Hitler would know nothing about it. And Eva Braun was, of course, always depressed on these occasions, never in a good mood.
For me, she was a beauty, and she was very sportive, and with skiing, with swimming, with bicycling, with every kind of sport. She did it with up to obsession, and I think it was one of the reasons why she did it, not to think about her situation, to push it away.
As Hitler occupied himself with the conquest of Europe, he faced the problem of a busy man with a dissatisfied mistress. He came up with the perennial solution: throw money at her. As the Luftwaffe launched itself at Britain and Russia, Hitler put his plane at the disposal of Eva and her family. The Brauns were finally under Hitler's spell. They accepted the relationship. And yet Eva's father, who had now joined the Nazi party, still felt the Führer should make an honest woman of his daughter. His feelings were shared throughout the family.
I admired her for being so beautiful, and I was ashamed. Of course, I was ashamed. Not being Hitler's mistress, to be a mistress at all, and especially Hitler. No.
While Hitler telephoned his orders to the front, the Brauns were calling up room service in Europe's finest cities. Hitler paid for shopping trips to Florence. Eva's shoes came from Ferragamo, her underwear from the Champs-Élysées. In various letters to friends, Eva listed how she spent Hitler's money.
Italian silk nightdresses, satin petticoats, 24 evening gowns, 12 fur coats, including fine silver fox fur, a mink and a sable. Gold evening shoes, black Ferragamo court shoes, brown leather day shoes with peep toes, and silver evening sandals.
The one possession she was missing was her Führer. He was now mostly at the Wolf's Lair in Rastenburg, East Prussia, close to what is now the Polish border with Russia. From here, he commanded the German army's offensive against Stalin. Eva never visited the Wolf's Lair, but she could at least speak to Hitler on the phone.
Every evening, at about 10 o'clock, a Munich telephone number had to be called. And then people told me that he would then speak to Eva Braun. And even though it was forbidden under pain of death, the telephonist making the connection was able to listen in. I did so one day. She would mostly thank him for presents, and he would say, "Right then, the main thing is that you're happy." He would say, "I'm glad you liked it, so be happy and quiet until tomorrow then."
Once, Hitler had all the time in the world at the Berghof. Now his visits were brief and intermittent. He made a wounding admission to Eva.
She said the Führer came to me last night and said that I must look for someone else, for he can no longer satisfy me as a man. Of course, he was very depressed. It was a very depressing time for him. But they didn't part. They stayed together. Whether they slept together after that, I don't know. I mean, you know, men who are depressed are not very good in bed. We all know this. It can become difficult.
Mit Hitler war sie verklemmt.
With Hitler, she was all closed up and artificial. With other men, she was immediately more relaxed, open, normal. Eva had had to do without everything with Hitler. You could see that during dances. That turned her into a completely different person. She was in really good form, danced a really racy tango.
Da gab sie sich hin.
Did Eva's frustration with Hitler propel her just once into a fling with someone else? In January 1944 at the Berghof, she met Hermann Fegelein, the cavalry commander. He was young, handsome, an expert horseman, and a ladies' man. His duties as an SS liaison officer brought him close to Hitler, and even closer to the Führer's mistress. This unofficial liaison was not lost on the ever-watchful secretary, Christa Schroeder.
It could not escape anyone's attention that she was attracted to Hermann Fegelein as a man, and that he also liked Eva Braun.
Und der Fegelein hat an der Fuß gefasst.
Fegelein got his foot in the door. He was a great admirer of Eva Braun and would very much have liked to have had her. And Hitler would have let her go. That is something that's not often said. If Eva found a suitable man and wanted him, then he would let her go.
Gibt sie so was frei.
Eva may have gazed adoringly at Fegelein, but did she sleep with him?
There's sexual chemistry between lots of people. You know, they look at each other and there is something. And if you think how very difficult it must have been with Hitler sometimes, I'm quite sure that she loved dancing, for instance. Fegelein was a very good dancer. You know, there was that sort of thing. I'm not trying to defend her. I don't think she needs defending. Besides, that's not the point. I don't care whether she slept with people or not. But I just don't think it fits. Doesn't fit. I think she was Hitler's girl. That's it.
In the end, Fegelein did marry into the Braun family, but Eva was only the bridesmaid. On the 3rd of June 1944, just 3 days before the Allied invasion of Europe, Fegelein married Eva's younger sister Gretel at Salzburg Town Hall. For Eva, the relationship with the Führer, despite his neglect, overrode everything. Her home was the Berghof. As the Allies pressed towards Germany from east and west in the summer of 1944, Eva was at last the undisputed mistress of Hitler's country seat. There were no more important visitors, no grand ceremonies, no glamour, just ordinary life. In July 1944, her young cousin Gertraud Weisker came to keep her company. They swam in the lakes and walked in the hills.
We went to the tea house down, that is about 500 to 600 meters down the mountain. And she had a key. We opened it, we sat down, and we were talking about everyday things.
And yet even here, high in the Bavarian Alps, they were never fully alone.
We went up the mountain a little bit when we were looking for strawberries, flowers, and always behind us there were SS people, and that was what was awful difficult for me, because I was always afraid to talk to Eva, because maybe they are listening, and this feeling was not good. I felt always under control.
While Eva saw out the summer of 1944 with Gertraud in the relative peace of the Berghof, another violent world was about to engulf her. January 1945. The RAF was pulverizing Germany's cities. Eva's home city of Munich had not escaped the devastation, and yet she shut her eyes to what was happening around her. She ignored Germany's impending defeat, just as throughout her years with Hitler, she had been able to delude herself as to what kind of man he really was.
Hitler protected this small circle amongst which he socially lived. He didn't really care, you know, what his generals knew. Of course his generals knew everything about everything bad that happened. And this was a matter of total indifference to him. What he didn't want was for those he emotionally depended on to know about it.
By the time the first concentration camps were liberated by the Allies, Adolf Hitler had gone into hiding in Berlin, The full enormity of his crimes was becoming known to the world. Eva now had a choice. Should she flee for safety, save her own skin and turn her back on Hitler? Or should she go to the side of the man she loved? In February, Eva, her decision made, kissed her parents goodbye. Her mother later recalled that the kiss was exceptionally long.
Denn der Hitler hat angeordnet, dass sie auf jeden Fall am Berghof.
Hitler had definitely ordered that she was to stay at the Berghof. Things in Munich and Berlin had become so dangerous. And we almost had an argument about that, she and I, because I was determined to stop her from going. I said, the boss wanted it this way. We always called Hitler the boss. But there was no stopping her. She upped and went.
The Soviet army was closing in on Berlin. Victory was in the Allies' grasp. Hitler and his entourage had taken refuge in a bunker beneath the Reichschancellery. Rochus Misch was one of Hitler's bodyguards in the Führer bunker.
So. Hier war
So, this is where the bunker was, where Hitler committed suicide. We saw the end of the Nazi era down here in the bunker. This is the bunker. This is it. Approximately 15 meters square. It was not large. 15 meters is not a lot. It was very depressing down there, and I did not feel at all happy that the head of the unit had posted me to the bunker. I would have preferred not to have to do my duty down there, but they always wanted you to do a good job, and if you had not been so good, they would probably have sent someone else.
The bunker was on 2 floors. The lower floor was where Hitler and Eva had their quarters. The atmosphere was dark and depressing, but Eva did her utmost to keep calm and look her best, as she always had done for Hitler.
We did then speak to her on the telephone in Berlin when conditions became increasingly serious. My husband said, "My lady, we will get you out from there. I have colleagues there, we will get you out." "No," she said, "I will stay with the Führer right up to the end." That was the last I ever heard of her.
She brought an element of life into Hitler's life, which existed for him in the early 30s, but not after 1941. You know, after Stalingrad, everything changed. The atmosphere changed radically around Hitler. And she maintained a lightness for him.
But nothing Eva could do could disguise the fact that Hitler was a broken man. She confessed to his secretaries that his appearance shocked her. After an absence of a few months, he had aged by a decade. Hitler railed against the misfortunes and treachery which had beset him. Surrounded by disaster, he seemed more interested in his pet Alsatian. Hitler's birthday was on the 20th of April. Sensing everyone else was losing respect for him, Eva was determined that the day should be special. The Nazi High Command came to wish him well before quietly slipping away. After Hitler had gone to bed, Eva persuaded her guests to accompany her above ground into the ruins of the Reichschancellery. It was the last time Eva Braun would dance until dawn. One of her partners was Hermann Fegelein. Christa Schroeder watched them.
I have a picture etched in my mind. At the end of a dance, as she lay in his arms, they gazed into each other's eyes with tenderness and longing.
The longing was short-lived. On the 25th of April, Fegelein tried to escape from the bunker. He was found with a girlfriend in an apartment in Berlin. At the time, his wife, Eva's sister Gretel, was pregnant. On Hitler's orders, Fegelein was brought back to the bunker and shot. Eva's brother-in-law had been killed by her lover. Deserted, betrayed, and finally accepting that the end was near, Hitler began to put his affairs in order.
Naja, ein bisschen Bewegung war immer da, Adjutant.
There were always comings and goings, and suddenly a complete stranger turned up, who I did not know. So I said to my friend the technician, "Who is that?" I did not know that man at all. My friend then told me he was an official from the registry office. The Führer was going to get married. I was taken aback and said, "What?" And then he said, "Yes, the Führer is going to marry."
Overhead were the rumblings of Russian shells and Allied bombs. When Eva signed her name, she wrote Braun in error, then crossed it out and wrote Eva Hitler. Two hours later, Hitler dictated his last will and testament.
Although during my years of struggle, I believed I could not undertake the responsibility of marriage, I have now decided to marry the young woman who came of her own free will to this city in order to share my fate. She goes to death with me as my wife, according to her own desire.
Eva wrote to her sister Gretel in Munich,
I must write you these words so that you will not feel sad over our end here in the shelter. It is rather we who are filled with sorrow, because it is your fate to live on into the chaos that will follow. For myself, I am glad to die here, glad to die at the side of the Führer, but most of all, glad that the horror now to come is spared me. What could life still give me?
They had been married only 36 hours. At 3 p.m. on the 30th of April, they returned to Hitler's room. Before they went inside, Hitler kissed Eva full on the lips, the first time anyone had ever seen him do so. Eva took poison. She had wanted to be a beautiful corpse. Hitler shot himself.
Jeder hat aufgepasst, ob den Schuss hört. Man wusste,
Everybody was waiting to see whether they could hear the shot. We knew he would shoot himself, and everybody was waiting. And then somebody called out, "I think the time has come." I did not hear a shot, but someone must have heard it. I do not know who called out. Well, when that person called out, everything went quiet. It was very quiet for a few minutes, and then I wanted to see what had happened. I can't remember who opened the door, but when the door was opened, I was interested to see. I went over a few paces to the right, and there I could see how Hitler had fallen. And Eva Braun was on the sofa, and she was wearing a dark blue dress with white sequins. And then, after I'd seen it, I ran away, but I became frightened and was afraid and confused and went back. And as I came back, I could see how Hitler was being wrapped in blankets on the floor. There were those moments when the doors were open, when you could see. I still managed to see that, and then I ran away. I went to the commander of our unit in the new Reich Chancellery and made my report. The Führer is dead. He is being carried out.
hier an dieser Stelle, vielleicht hier,
And over here,
genau weiß man das nicht.
it's difficult
Hier
to
ist
say
Hitler
exactly.
verbrannt worden. Hier war eine
Hitler was burned.
Eine Granatrichter, und da ist Hitler hier.
There was a bomb crater,
Ja,
and this is where Hitler was laid
ja, ja.
and wrapped in blankets.
Ist dann Hitler
I saw that,
reingelegt worden, in Baden-Württemberg
how Hitler was wrapped in grey blankets.
unten alles gesehen, wie Hitler
And then
eingewickelt wurde
he was
in
put here in
so
the
eine
bomb
graue
crater
Dann wurde
and had
hier
petrol
rein
poured over
in
him
den Bomben
and was
mit
burned
Benzin
together
gegossen
with Eva Braun.
und verbrannt. Mit Eva Braun zusammen.
Within days of Hitler and Eva's suicide, Germany had surrendered to the Allies. Berlin was in ruins, and the Nazi reign of terror was over.
It was her intention to stay with him, and I have to accept what she did. She is a grown-up person. I think she thought about what she was doing. It was the wrong man, but I have to respect it. It began like a very, very simple love story, and it ended in a Greek tragedy.
There are no memorials or monuments to Hitler and his mistress. No headstones, no graves. Their ashes have disappeared forever. Early in the war, when all was going well, Eva had said to a friend,
When the chief has won the war, he has promised me that I can go to Hollywood and play my own part in the film of our life story.
but she was wrong. What had been the fantasy of a glamorous life with a famous man turned out to be a terrible illusion.
Next week at 10:45, the relationship between Hitler and Hess. Coming up next, the Apostles.